Hello, this is Chris, and welcome to the second class in my series, The Constant Gardener. So in this second class, we're looking at the story of Naomi in the book of Ruth, and it's entitled Naomi's Exile and Return. Before we go into that, just a bit of a summary of what we looked at in the first class. The title Constant Gardener is intended to depict God as a constant, that the Bible is one story, and the God we see in Jesus is the same God we see depicted in stories like the one we're looking at today, or Jonah we're going to look at next week. So we're using biblical narrative as a genre and looking at how biblical authors present the stories of the Bible in such a way as to demonstrate themes and use character references, etc., as we looked at last week. And we saw in the first class how two examples where Abraham and Moses went through events that were later paralleled by events that the nation of Israel went through as a whole. This is one of the sort of themes we see, and that's again a theme we're going to see today, where Naomi represents Israel. And I was remiss last week, I put a picture of the book you can see on the Writer House for My Name by Peter Lightout, but I forgot to reference it. So that's been a big inspiration for this series, an excellent survey of the Old Testament, bringing out a lot of themes and a lot of great insight. So I highly recommend that. So, as we said, there are a number of themes in the Old Testament that we see fulfilled in Jesus, including life from death and exile and restoration. And they're both quite closely linked. And we see these two themes appearing in the book of Ruth. So, background to the story of Naomi. So it's the era of the judges, and Israel has strayed towards idols, and as such she is unfaithful in terms of her covenant relationship to her effectively husband. That's the imagery that's used in the Bible, to God, and this will ultimately lead to God abandoning Israel in the exile. So, as I mentioned before, we've seen the two stories involving Abraham and Moses last week, and how they foreshadowed national events. And in this story, we see that Naomi appears to be a type or a foreshadow of Israel going through the experience of being abandoned in exile. But this abandonment I've put deliberately in inverted commas, because the story points ultimately to mercy and restoration. So Naomi has an exile experience, but she is restored. So, thinking about Ruth as an example of narrative, I talked about how a lot of these themes can only really be seen retrospectively. So we get, it would appear, stories that have been long in the memory being rewritten to present certain themes, to pick out certain details that the redactor, the author, want to bring to the attention of the reader. And we see in the very first verse, it says, "In the days when the days when the judges ruled." So it's looking back to a previous era, and then it finally ends with the genealogy of King David. So we can see it's looking back from beyond the time of David back to the time of the judges. So the significance of the story can only be seen retrospectively, because although it was in itself a touching story, the fact that Ruth is the ancestor of not only David, but from our perspective, Jesus as well, then that sheds an even greater light and makes sense of it. So in terms of the way it sits into this one big story that God is revealing through the Bible. So let's think about the story that we see in the book of Ruth. So Bethlehem means house of bread, but in the time in question, there is a famine, and a man called Elimelech takes his wife, Naomi, and his 2 sons to Moab to escape the famine. His sons both marry Moabite women, but it would appear, there's nothing in the text to suggest that there was a mass exodus, that it appears that the other residents of Bethlehem have remained in place. And in rabbinic tradition, it's stated that the fact that Elimelech and his 2 sons both die is a punishment because of their unfaithfulness. A, because they've left the promised land, and B, because they've married foreign women. So Naomi loses her husbands and sons, and that effectively meant she's lost her seed and therefore her future. So we see a picture of abandonment. Obviously, none of the 3 men who've died have done so deliberately, but it represents an abandonment. And if we see this image of Naomi representing Israel, then we can see that this is a picture of exile, and Israel in exile being abandoned by God. And it's important to understand what this abandonment involves so that we can understand or get a better understanding of what the exile meant for Israel. Because, as I said earlier, Naomi's story is ultimately, it's not simply a story of exile, but it's a story of exile and restoration. So that has implications for what the exile meant for Israel. Leaving full, returning empty. There's a theme in the stories of the patriarchs of leaving empty and returning full. You think of Jacob, you think of Joseph. Joseph didn't literally return for several centuries as a pile of bones, but in the sense that he left as a slave, spent time in prison, but ultimately rose to high office and riches. And by the time his bones were taken back, his family had become a nation. So that's a typical theme we expect to see. For Naomi, though, the story is in the opposite direction. Naomi leaves full with husband and sons, but returns empty as a widow with no children. And she says in chapter 1, verse 21 of Ruth, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Lord and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So we see that Naomi is bitter, and she's blaming God for her suffering and her loss. So in this miserable state, she hears that there is once more bread in Bethlehem, and she decides that this is the best option for her to go back, but she sees no hope of providing husbands for her 2 daughters-in-law. She has no more sons to give them, so she urges them to go back to their families. But of course, Ruth decides to go with her, and she shows what the Hebrew term is hesed, and it's a kindness based on loyalty. So she shows hesed to Naomi, and when they go back, Boaz, Naomi's relative, shows kindness to both herself and Ruth. And when Naomi returns to Israel, she becomes full once more. So there we see this picture of exile and restoration. So Boaz performs a role known as a kinsman redeemer. Just a bit of background to that. So at the time of the Exodus and conquest, the tribes were all given land in the promised land, at least in the countryside. Each tribe, clan, and family were given a parcel of land. And if any fell into need, the law provided a means by which they could effectively lease this land to try to recover from debt. They could even lease their services as a servant as well. So the law provided means of dealing with debt, but in such a way that there could ultimately be restoration, that land could be reacquired by the family. So if the person had leased out the land or their own service was unable to redeem themselves, a relative could do that. And in this case, the kinsman redeemer is Naomi's relative, Boaz. And so Naomi is restored to Israel through Boaz, and this in effect restores what she had lost through the death of her husband. When Boaz learns of Ruth's kindness to Naomi, it says in Ruth 2 verse 12, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So Boaz here is talking to Ruth in terms of her coming into the covenant people. And this covenant is described as being under God's wing. That was an imagery of covenant, that Israel was under God's wings. And then subsequently in the story, Boaz places his cloak over Ruth, and that was a similar symbol. So God's wing was a means of describing the covenant with Israel, and Boaz's cloak, taking Ruth under his wing, is a sign of a covenant, but in the terms of a man and a woman, it's the covenant of marriage. So we see again this wider imagery. And Boaz gives barley to Ruth so that she doesn't return empty-handed. So breaking this cycle of returning, going full and returning empty. So Ruth and Boaz are married, and they have a son, Obed. And Naomi becomes nurse to Obed, and the women of Bethlehem say, "A son has been born to Naomi." So even though literally this is the son of Ruth, they see it as a child to replace the sons that she has lost. So Naomi effectively has seed once more. And here we see a sort of hint at the theme of life from death. Naomi has lost her sons, but this woman with no husband has a son once more. Life from death, exile and restoration. So, like the prodigal son in Jesus' parable, Naomi's family went into self-imposed exile. Naomi returns bitter, similar in attitude to the prodigal son's brother. Whereas Ruth, a Gentile, demonstrates how an exile should return, full of kindness and hope, with a desire to give and to help Naomi. So Naomi is made full again by a loving, patient God, the same God that we see Jesus describe in his parable. And there's a blessing given by the elders to Boaz, which we find in the last chapter, verses 11 and 12. It says, "Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah.'" Now, why this blessing? Rachel and Leah obviously were the mothers of the 12 sons of Jacob. But what about this bit at the end? may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So if we think about that story, so Jesus, we know from his genealogy, traces his line back to Abraham through Judah, one of the sons of Jacob. But in Genesis 38, we see that Judah's seed was in jeopardy. In other words, were he to have no seed, then there would not have been no line, not only to David, but also not to Jesus. So it's only in that kind of retrospect that we can see the significance of this story. So Judah had married a Canaanite woman who gave him 3 sons, Onan and Shelah. Marries Tamar, but it says was evil in the sight of the Lord and lost his life. So Tamar finds herself in a similar situation to Naomi. She has no husband, she has no son, and therefore she has a bleak future. But as according to the law, Judah called on his son Onan to give his brother seed, to produce a son through Tamar. But Onan refuses to do so, which again God considers to be evil, and Onan dies. So still Tamar has no husband and no son. But Judah fails to give his 3rd son, Shelah, to Tamar. So she takes action herself to correct this failure to fulfill the law on behalf of Judah. And like Rebecca before her, she uses a disguise to receive the blessing Judah should have given her. And in the story, it would appear, deliberately disguises herself as a prostitute and produces a son with Judah himself, her own father-in-law. And through that union, she gives birth to twins, Perez and Zerah. So it's a messy story. So remember the blessing that Boaz was given. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So the significance of this is that Perez was the 2nd born of the twins. Zerah would have actually legally been the son of the 1st husband who had died. So Judah had effectively given his own son a son. And this is why Onan had refused to produce a son with Tamar, because, as it says in verse 9, he knew that the offspring would not be his, it would be Earth. So likewise, Obed, in the story of Ruth and Naomi, Obed was legally the son of Mahlon, Ruth's 1st husband. So if Ruth bore a 2nd son, like Perez, he would fully be the son of Boaz. So it actually ends, Book of Ruth, with the genealogy of Perez going through Boaz to King David. So here we see in just in this genealogy how the story of Ruth is so much more than the story of just Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. It's part of a much bigger story going back to Perez, going forward to David, and as we can see, even further forward to Jesus. So Ruth's hesed, that loyalty, kindness in loyalty that Ruth showed to Naomi, led to her being the great grandmother of King David, and as I say, in the line of Jesus. It's worth thinking just about what that demonstrates about the character of God, that Jesus is attached to this rather messy story of Tamar disguising herself as a prostitute and producing a son through her father-in-law Judah. At the time of Jesus, most of the tribes of Israel had been lost in the first exile, the Assyrian exile, and all that remains is Judah, which the Romans called Judea in terms of its geographic entity. And the term Jew is derived from Judah. So God's son has a very tainted family tree. And yet, remarkably, Matthew, in his genealogy of Jesus, rather than try to hide it, he actually draws our attention to it, because not only does Matthew take the genealogy that we find in the book of Ruth, but he inserts into it the names of 4 women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, referred to as the wife of Uriah. So if we think about that, Ruth and Rahab, and quite probably Tamar as well, were foreign, whereas Bathsheba was married to a foreigner. Rahab was a prostitute and Tamar pretended to be a prostitute. All these women are tainted in one or more ways, and yet Matthew highlights them rather than women like Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. So what does this tell us about how God uses people, how God sometimes uses the tainted and those who are not highly esteemed in their society? What does it demonstrate about God's nature that he uses people like that, that he looks on the situation of someone like Naomi in exile and yet brings her, despite her attitude, into a state of restoration, makes her full again? And what does it suggest about God's desire to restore us to a happy ending? That's the end of this class then. So until next week, when we look at the story of Jonah, thank you for watching.